My hands trembled as I set down the phone, the dial tone still buzzing in my ear like an angry wasp. Lysander's voice echoed in my mind, each word sharper than broken glass. Isadora, we've talked about this as a family. You're just too unpredictable, too awkward. We can't risk you saying something inappropriate or causing a scene at the wedding. I stared at the cream-colored invitation that had arrived just 3 weeks prior, my name elegantly scripted in gold calligraphy alongside the request for my presence at the union of Lysander Pemberton Ashworth and Evangeline Rosalind Thornfield. The date was circled in red on my calendar, the dress already hanging in my closet, the gift carefully wrapped and waiting by my front door, all of it now rendered meaningless by a 15-minute phone conversation that had just shattered whatever remained of my relationship with my younger brother. The late afternoon sun filtered through my kitchen window, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor where I stood frozen, clutching the invitation like evidence of my own inadequacy. Outside, the neighborhood hummed with its usual Friday evening rhythm. Children playing, dogs barking, families gathering for dinner. Normal families, functional families, families where awkward older sisters weren't systematically excluded from the most important moments of their siblings' lives. I sank into the worn wooden chair at my small dining table, the same table where I'd eaten countless meals alone over the past 12 years since moving into this modest rental house. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd chosen this particular neighborhood specifically because it was only 20 minutes from my childhood home, close enough to remain connected to my family, far enough to maintain some semblance of independence. Now, I wondered if the distance should have been measured in miles rather than minutes, in continents rather than counties. The wedding was tomorrow, Saturday, September 21st, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon at the historic Whitmore estate, followed by a reception for 350 guests. I knew these details because I'd helped Evangeline choose the venue 8 months ago, back when I was still considered a trusted member of the wedding party, back before my parents and brother had apparently held secret family meetings to determine that my presence posed an unacceptable risk to their perfect day. My mind wandered to Evangeline, beautiful and poised Evangeline with her cascade of auburn hair and her finishing school manners. She'd been nothing but kind to me during the 18 months she'd been dating my brother, always including me in conversations, always asking about my work at the library, always treating me like a real sister, rather than an unfortunate family obligation, which made this exclusion sting even more deeply, because surely she'd been part of the decision. Surely she'd agreed that I was too much of a liability to risk having at her wedding. The phone rang again, jarring me from my spiral of self-pity. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but the caller ID showed my mother's number, and avoiding Octavia Ashworth had never been a realistic option for anyone, least of all her disappointing eldest daughter. Isadora, darling, I know you're upset, but you have to understand that this decision wasn't made lightly. My mother's voice carried that particular tone she'd perfected over the years, the one that managed to sound both sympathetic and condescending simultaneously. We're only thinking of what's best for Lysander and Evangeline. Their wedding day should be perfect, and you know how you get in social situations. How I get in social situations. As if my introversion was some kind of communicable disease, as if my tendency toward honest observation rather than empty small talk was a character flaw that might somehow contaminate the entire celebration. I'd spent 34 years on this earth, 34 years as the elder daughter, the one who had helped raise Lysander when our parents were too busy with their respective careers to notice what their children needed. I'd been the one to teach him to tie his shoes, to help him with his mathematics homework, to listen to his teenage heartbreaks, and offer what comfort I could manage. Mother, I'm not some kind of social disaster waiting to happen, I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. I'm a functioning adult with a master's degree in library science and a responsible job. I volunteer at the animal shelter every weekend. I've never caused a scene at any family gathering. Well, no, but you do have a tendency to make those observations of yours, she replied, and I could practically hear her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against her desk. Remember Uncle Mortimer's funeral? You told Aunt Cordelia that her eulogy was factually inaccurate because Uncle Mortimer had never actually served in the military? Because he hadn't? I protested. He worked in a munitions factory during the war, which is honorable work, but it's not the same as being a decorated veteran. I thought honesty mattered. Honesty doesn't always matter more than kindness, darling. Sometimes people need their illusions, especially at emotionally charged events like weddings and funerals. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar weight of being fundamentally misunderstood by the people who were supposed to know me best. My mother wasn't entirely wrong about my tendency toward inconvenient truths, but she'd never understood that my honesty came from a place of respect rather than cruelty. I believed people deserved the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. I believed that authenticity was more valuable than social polish, that meaningful conversations were worth more than empty pleasantries. Where's Father in all this? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Your father agrees with us completely. He's particularly concerned about some of the business associates who'll be attending. The Thornfield family has significant connections in the pharmaceutical industry, and Oberon is hoping to secure some consulting contracts. We simply can't afford any irregularities. There it was, the real reason lurking beneath the surface concern for my social inadequacies. This wedding wasn't just about Lysander and Evangeline's love story. It was a networking opportunity, a business transaction dressed up in white silk and ivory roses. My potential for social awkwardness wasn't just embarrassing, it was economically threatening. I see, I said quietly. So this is about Father's business interests? It's about family, my mother corrected, but her tone suggested she knew how hollow that sounded. We're all making sacrifices to ensure this day goes smoothly. Lysander has been under tremendous pressure planning this wedding, and Evangeline's family has such high expectations. I thought about the Evangeline I'd come to know over the past year and a half, the young woman who'd seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts and opinions, who'd asked my advice about everything from wedding flowers to career decisions. She was completing her dissertation in art history at the university where I worked, and we'd spent countless afternoons discussing Renaissance paintings and medieval manuscripts. She'd never seemed like someone who would demand social perfection from her future sister-in-law. What does Evangeline think about this decision? I asked. There was a pause, just long enough to confirm my suspicions. Evangeline is focused on her wedding preparations. She's trusting us to handle the family arrangements, which meant Evangeline either didn't know about my exclusion or she'd been pressured into agreeing with it. Neither possibility offered much comfort, but at least it suggested that this betrayal might not have originated with the woman I'd hoped to call my sister. After hanging up with my mother, I wandered through my small house like a ghost haunting her own life. Everything felt surreal, as if I'd awakened in some alternate version of reality where I was the family pariah rather than simply the quiet, bookish daughter who preferred cats to crowds and library stacks to social gatherings. The house felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing in with the weight of my isolation. I found myself standing in front of the mirror in my bedroom, studying the woman staring back at me. At 34, I was neither beautiful nor hideous, neither stylish nor slovenly. My brown hair was practical rather than fashionable, pulled back in a simple bun that kept it out of my face while I worked. My clothes were sensible, well-made pieces that would last for years rather than trendy items that would be obsolete by next season. I looked like exactly what I was, a librarian, a woman who valued substance over style, someone more comfortable with books than people. Was this really so threatening? Was my mere presence enough to jeopardize an entire wedding celebration? I tried to imagine myself at the reception, sitting quietly at the family table, making polite conversation with whoever was seated nearby, perhaps sharing a dance with my father, or offering congratulations to the happy couple. Even in my imagination, I couldn't conjure any scenario where my behavior would cause the kind of disruption my family seemed to fear. The gift I'd chosen for Lysander and Evangeline sat on my dresser, wrapped in silver paper with a white ribbon. Inside was a first edition of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Sonnets from the Portuguese, which I'd found at an estate sale 3 months ago. Evangeline had mentioned her love for Victorian poetry during one of our conversations, and I'd thought it would be perfect for a couple beginning their life together. Now it felt like evidence of my naivete, proof that I'd fundamentally misunderstood my role in this family drama. I picked up the book and held it gently, running my fingers over the aged leather binding. The inscription I'd written on the title page suddenly seemed pathetic rather than heartfelt. To Lysander and Evangeline, may your love story be as enduring as the greatest poetry. With all my love and best wishes for a lifetime of happiness, Isadora. I'd spent 20 minutes crafting those words, wanting to strike the perfect balance between formal and affectionate, literary and personal. Now they read like the desperate attempts of an outsider trying to claim a place that had never been offered. The afternoon wore on with agonizing slowness. I tried to distract myself with household chores, reorganizing my already immaculate bookshelves. I'm preparing a simple dinner I had no appetite to eat, grading papers from the continuing education classes I taught at the community college. Nothing worked. My mind kept circling back to tomorrow's wedding, to the empty chair that should have been mine, to the family photographs that would forever document my absence from my only brother's most important day. Around 7 o'clock, my neighbor Mrs. Delacroix knocked on my door, concern etched across her weathered face. Eleanor Delacroix was 78 years old and had lived next door for 6 years, ever since her husband passed away and she downsized from the family home. She was one of the few people who seemed to appreciate my quiet nature rather than seeing it as something that needed to be fixed. "Isadora, dear, I saw you through the window and you looked distressed," she said, holding a covered dish that smelled wonderfully of herbs and comfort. "I made too much cassoulet again, and I thought you might like some company for dinner." I invited her in, grateful for the distraction and the kindness. Eleanor settled into my living room with the ease of someone who'd become genuinely fond of me over the years. her sharp blue eyes taking in my obvious distress without comment. We ate together in comfortable silence for a while before she finally spoke. "Family troubles?" she asked gently. I found myself telling her everything, the words spilling out like water through a broken dam. Eleanor listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of sympathy, but never interrupting with advice or platitudes. When I finished, she sat quietly for a moment, considering her response. "You know, dear, I've lived long enough to see that families can be the source of our greatest joy and our deepest wounds, sometimes simultaneously," she said finally. "Your parents and brother may believe they're protecting something by excluding you, but what they're really protecting is their own comfort. It's easier to manage a wedding when everyone fits into neat, predictable categories." "But what if they're right?" I asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at me all afternoon. "What if I really am too awkward, too prone to saying the wrong thing? Maybe I would have ruined their perfect day somehow." Eleanor reached across the table and took my hand in her surprisingly strong grip. "Isadora, I've known you for 6 years, and I've never once seen you be anything but thoughtful and considerate. Yes, you speak your mind, and yes, you don't suffer fools gladly, but those are strengths, not weaknesses. The world needs more people who value truth over convenience." Her words offered some comfort, but they couldn't erase the sting of rejection or the growing sense that I'd spent my entire adult life fundamentally misunderstanding my place in my own family. After Eleanor left, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by the books and photographs and small treasures that made up my carefully constructed life. Tomorrow, while 350 people celebrated my brother's marriage, I would be here, alone, listening for the echo of laughter and music that might drift across the 20-minute distance between their joy and my isolation. I went to bed early that Friday night, hoping that sleep might provide some refuge from the emotional turmoil of the day. Instead, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and replaying every family gathering, every conversation, every moment that might have contributed to this final exclusion. Had I really been so difficult, so socially inept, so fundamentally incompatible with my own family that they couldn't risk my presence at the most important celebration of my brother's life? Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of empty wedding chapels and silent reception halls, of reaching for my brother's hand only to find him stepping away, always just beyond my grasp. I woke Saturday morning with a headache and a heart heavy with resignation, accepting that today would unfold without me, that my family's happiness would be preserved by my absence. The morning passed with excruciating normalcy. I made coffee, read the newspaper, tended to my small garden in the backyard. The weather was perfect for a wedding, clear and warm with just enough breeze to keep the heat from becoming oppressive. I found myself imagining the preparations taking place at the Whitmore estate, the florists arranging centerpieces, the caterers preparing elegant appetizers, the wedding party getting ready in luxurious suites while photographers captured every precious moment. Around noon, I received a text message from my cousin Penelope, who lived 3 states away and apparently hadn't been informed about my exile. "So excited to see you at the wedding today. Can't wait to catch up." I stared at the message for several minutes before typing back a simple lie. Won't be able to make it after all. Have a wonderful time. The deception felt necessary, a small mercy that would spare both of us the awkward explanation of why exactly I'd been deemed unfit for family celebration. I spent the afternoon attempting to read, but concentration proved impossible. Every few minutes, I found myself checking the clock, marking the progression of events I should have been participating in. 2 o'clock, the wedding party would be getting dressed, final touches being applied to hair and makeup. 3 o'clock, photographs would be taken, nervous energy building as the ceremony approached. 4 o'clock, Lysander and Evangeline would exchange vows in front of everyone who mattered to them, everyone except his only sister. At 6:30, I made the mistake of driving past the Whitmore estate. I told myself I was just running errands, just happening to take the route that would lead me past the wedding venue, but even I wasn't naive enough to believe my own rationalization. I needed to see it, needed some tangible proof that this celebration was really happening without me, that my family had successfully orchestrated their perfect day in my absence. The estate looked magnificent, exactly as I'd imagined it would. The parking area was filled with expensive cars, and I could see elegantly dressed guests moving between the main house and the garden pavilion where the reception was presumably taking place. Soft music drifted across the manicured grounds, punctuated by the sound of laughter and conversation. It looked like something from a magazine, a flawless celebration of love and commitment, and I felt like an intruder, even observing it from the public road. I drove home with tears blurring my vision, feeling more isolated than I'd ever felt in my life. The house welcomed me back with its familiar silence, and I tried to lose myself in the routine of evening chores, anything to keep my mind occupied until enough time had passed for the wedding to be safely over, for my family to have successfully celebrated without the risk of my social inadequacy. Around 8 o'clock, I decided to watch television, hoping that mindless entertainment might provide some distraction from the emotional weight of the day. I settled onto my sofa with a cup of tea and reached for the remote, scanning through channels until I found a local news program that seemed innocuous enough. The anchor was discussing weekend events around the city, highlighting various festivals and celebrations that were taking place. And now we have some breaking news from the Whitmore estate, where what was supposed to be the wedding of the year has taken an unexpected turn, the anchor said, and I felt my blood turn to ice in my veins. The screen shifted to footage that had obviously been taken by someone's cell phone, shaky and poorly focused, but unmistakably real. I could see the elegant garden pavilion I'd glimpsed from the road, filled with hundreds of beautifully dressed guests, all of them turned toward a makeshift stage where a woman in a stunning white wedding dress stood facing a man in a black tuxedo. But this wasn't the romantic scene I'd expected to see. The woman, Evangeline, was gesticulating wildly, her perfect updo coming undone as she moved. Even without sound, I could tell she was shouting, her face flushed with anger, her elegant composure completely shattered. The man, my brother Lysander, stood frozen in apparent shock, his hands raised defensively as if trying to calm her down. The newscaster's voice continued over the footage. What started as an elegant reception has turned into a very public confrontation between the bride and groom, with guests looking on in apparent shock. I watched in horrified fascination as Evangeline reached up and delivered a resounding slap across my brother's face, the sound audible Even through the poor quality of the recording, the collective gasp from the 350 wedding guests was unmistakable, a sharp intake of breath that seemed to echo through my living room. Evangeline then gathered up her elaborate skirts and stormed toward the exit, leaving Lysander standing alone on the stage, one hand pressed to his reddened cheek, surrounded by stunned silence. The footage ended, and the anchor returned to the screen with barely concealed excitement at having such dramatic local news to report. The cause of the altercation is unknown at this time, but witnesses report that the bride appeared to be confronting the groom about something she'd just learned. We'll continue to follow this developing story. I sat frozen on my sofa, the remote clutched in my trembling hand, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. The perfect wedding my family had been so desperate to protect, the flawless celebration that required my exclusion to ensure its success, had just imploded in the most public and spectacular way imaginable. Whatever Evangeline had discovered, whatever had prompted her to slap my brother and storm out of her own wedding reception, it had created exactly the kind of scene my family had been so afraid I might cause. The irony was bitter and overwhelming. They'd excluded me to prevent embarrassment, to avoid the risk of social awkwardness, to protect their precious image and business connections. And yet, here they were, featured on the evening news as the wedding disaster of the year, their humiliation broadcast to anyone with a television set. My phone began ringing almost immediately, the caller ID showing my mother's number. I let it go to voicemail, then watched as text messages began flooding in from relatives and family friends who'd apparently seen the news coverage. The messages ranged from concerned to gleeful, some asking if I knew what had happened, others expressing shock that the perfect Ashworth family wedding had ended in such public disaster. I turned off my phone and sat in the growing darkness of my living room, trying to understand what I was feeling. Part of me felt vindicated, as if the universe had delivered some kind of cosmic justice for my unfair exclusion. But a larger part of me felt genuinely sorry for my brother, for Evangeline, for the public humiliation they were both enduring. Whatever had gone wrong between them, whatever secret had been revealed, it had clearly been devastating enough to destroy their relationship in front of hundreds of witnesses. The questions multiplied in my mind like fractals, each one spawning dozens more. What had Evangeline discovered? Had Lysander been unfaithful? Had he lied about something fundamental? Had someone else revealed a damaging secret at the worst possible moment? And why hadn't anyone in my family thought to call me, to let me know what had happened, to include me in whatever crisis management they were undoubtedly attempting? I realized with a start that I was still holding the wrapped gift I'd intended for the happy couple, the first edition poetry book that now seemed like an artifact from a different lifetime. The inscription I'd written felt prophetic in the worst possible way. May your love story be as enduring as the greatest poetry. Apparently, their love story was going to endure about as long as a newspaper headline, destined to be remembered primarily for its spectacular failure rather than its romantic promise. As I sat there in the darkness, surrounded by the wreckage of what should have been my brother's happiest day, I found myself thinking about all the conversations I'd had with Evangeline over the past 18 months. She'd always seemed so composed, so certain about her feelings for Lysander, so excited about their future together. What could possibly have happened to transform her from the radiant bride I'd imagined into the furious woman I'd just watched storm away from her own wedding? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I actually knew about my brother's relationship with his new wife. Yes, I'd spent time with Evangeline, and yes, we'd developed what I'd thought was a genuine friendship. But most of our conversations had been about books and art and academic pursuits. We'd rarely discussed the intimate details of her relationship with Lysander, and I'd assumed that was simply proper discretion on her part. Now, I wondered if there had been problems beneath the surface that none of us had seen, cracks in their perfect facade that had finally split wide open under the pressure of their wedding day. My thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at my front door. It was nearly 9 o'clock, well past the time when neighbors might stop by for casual visits, and I couldn't imagine who would be calling on me at this hour. For a moment, I considered simply ignoring it, pretending I wasn't home, but the knocking continued with increasing urgency. When I finally opened the door, I found myself face to face with Evangeline Thornfield, still wearing her wedding dress, but looking nothing like the composed bride I'd expected to see on this evening. Her elaborate hairdo had completely fallen apart, auburn curls hanging loose around her shoulders. Her makeup was smeared with tears, and there were grass stains on the hem of her expensive gown. She looked like she'd been running or walking very fast for a considerable distance. "Isadora," she said, her voice hoarse and strained, "I need to talk to you, please." I stepped aside wordlessly, too stunned to do anything but let her into my small living room. She stood in the center of the space, looking lost and desperate, her elaborate wedding dress seeming absurdly out of place among my simple furniture and book-lined walls. "I saw the news coverage," I said carefully, not sure how to begin this conversation. "I'm so sorry about whatever happened tonight." Evangeline laughed, but it was a bitter sound with no humor in it. "You're sorry? Isadora, you're the only person who has nothing to be sorry for. You're the only one who wasn't part of this elaborate deception." She sank down onto my sofa, the layers of silk and tulle spreading around her like spilled cream. I had never seen her look so defeated, so utterly lost. This was not the confident young woman who discussed Renaissance art with such passion, not the poised fiancé who'd handled wedding preparations with such apparent ease. "I don't understand," I said gently, settling into the chair across from her. "What deception? What happened at the reception?" Evangeline looked up at me with eyes that held a pain so raw it was difficult to witness. "Your family didn't want you at the wedding because they knew you'd figure it out. They knew you'd see through their lies because you actually pay attention to details, because you ask the right questions, because you're not willing to just accept pretty stories when they don't add up." My heart began to race as I processed her words. Whatever had destroyed her marriage tonight, whatever had caused her to slap my brother and walk away from 350 guests, it was somehow connected to my exclusion from the wedding. The very qualities my family had deemed socially dangerous, my tendency toward observation and honest inquiry, were apparently the same qualities that would have exposed some kind of family secret. "Evangeline, I need you to tell me what happened," I said, leaning forward in my chair. "Start from the beginning." She took a shuddering breath and began to speak, her voice growing stronger as she continued. "It started during the reception dinner. I was sitting at the head table feeling so happy, so grateful to be part of your family. Your mother was making a toast about how welcome I felt, how much they all loved me, how they couldn't wait to have me as a daughter-in-law. She paused, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. That's when your great-aunt Cordelia approached the table. She was quite elderly and seemed a bit confused, but she kept insisting she needed to talk to me about something important. Your parents tried to redirect her, said she was having one of her spells, but she was very persistent. I remembered Great-Aunt Cordelia vaguely, my father's elderly aunt, who lived in a nursing home about an hour away. She was in her late 80s and did sometimes get confused, mixing up names and dates, but she'd always been sharp about certain things, especially family history. "What did she want to tell you?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer would be something my parents very much hadn't wanted revealed. She said she needed to congratulate me on marrying Lysander, but she wanted to make sure I knew the truth about the family. She said it wasn't fair to let me enter into marriage without knowing what kind of people I was joining. Evangeline's voice was growing harder now, anger beginning to replace the devastation. She told me that your parents had specifically excluded you from the wedding because they were afraid you'd ask too many questions about the family finances. I felt a chill run down my spine. The family finances? Your great aunt told me that your father's business hasn't been as successful as he pretends, that he's been living on credit and borrowed money for the past 3 years, maintaining the appearance of prosperity while actually facing bankruptcy. She said the only reason he could afford to pay for this elaborate wedding was because he'd taken out loans against your inheritance. The room seemed to spin around me as I absorbed this information. My inheritance, the modest trust fund my maternal grandmother had left me, was supposed to be untouchable until I turned 40. I'd never paid much attention to the financial details, trusting my parents to manage it appropriately. The idea that my father might have been using that money to fund his failing business, to pay for Lysander's wedding, to maintain their lifestyle while excluding me from family decisions was almost too horrible to contemplate. But that's not the worst part, Evangeline continued, her voice now sharp with betrayal. Your great-aunt told me that the reason you were really excluded from the wedding wasn't because you're socially awkward. It's because you work at the university, because you have access to financial records and legal databases, because you might have looked into the family trust and discovered what your father had done. I sat back in my chair, feeling like all the air had been knocked out of my lungs. Everything suddenly made sense. All the careful maneuvering, all the concern about my potential for social embarrassment, all the emphasis on protecting their business connections. They hadn't been afraid I'd say something inappropriate at the wedding. They'd been afraid I'd discover that my father had been embezzling from my inheritance to fund their lavish lifestyle. "What did you do when she told you this?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. I confronted Lysander immediately, right there during the reception dinner. I asked him if he knew about your inheritance, if he knew why you'd really been excluded from our wedding, and the look on his face, Isadora, the absolute guilt and panic in his eyes, told me everything I needed to know. She stood up abruptly, pacing across my small living room like a caged animal. He tried to deny it at first, said your great-aunt was confused, said I was overreacting, but I kept pushing, kept asking questions, and finally he admitted that he'd known about the financial situation for months. He'd known your father was using your inheritance, and he'd agreed to exclude you from the wedding to prevent you from finding out. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd thought possible. My younger brother, the boy I'd helped raise, the man I'd supported through every challenge and celebration of his adult life, had knowingly participated in stealing from me. He'd allowed our parents to exclude me from his wedding, not to protect some vague social standard, but to conceal a crime. I couldn't marry him after that, Evangeline said, turning to face me with tears streaming down her face. How could I start a marriage with someone who would lie to me about something so fundamental? How could I become part of a family that would steal from their own daughter and then gaslight her into believing she was the problem? I understood now why she'd slapped him, why she'd walked away from hundreds of guests and thousands of dollars in wedding expenses. The foundation of their relationship had been built on deception, and once that was revealed, everything else had crumbled. I'm so sorry, I said, and I meant it. Whatever vindication I might have felt about my family's public humiliation was overwhelmed by genuine sadness for Evangeline's pain. She'd lost her marriage, her faith in the man she'd loved, her trust in the family she'd hoped to join. Don't apologize to me, she said firmly. You're the victim here, Isadora. They stole from you, lied to you, excluded you from your own brother's wedding to cover up their crimes. I just happened to get caught in the crossfire. She moved toward the door, then paused and turned back to me. There's something else you need to know. After I confronted Lysander, after I walked away from the reception, I went back to his apartment to get my things. I found financial documents on his desk, papers from your father's business, loan applications that listed your inheritance as collateral. She reached into the small purse she'd been carrying and pulled out a folded stack of papers. I took copies of everything. I thought you should have them, should know exactly what they've done and how much money is involved. I took the papers with trembling hands, not yet ready to examine them, but grateful that she'd thought to gather evidence. What will you do now? I asked. I'm going back to my parents' house tonight, and tomorrow I'm calling a lawyer, she said decisively. I want to make sure you know all your legal options, want to help you recover what's rightfully yours. It's the least I can do after my wedding became the vehicle for exposing their deception. After she left, I sat alone with the financial documents spread across my coffee table, trying to make sense of the numbers and legal language that documented my family's betrayal. The amount of money involved was staggering, far more than I'd realized was in my inheritance account. My father hadn't just borrowed against the trust, he'd systematically drained it over the past 3 years, using my grandmother's gift to fund his failing business and maintain his family's standard of living while I lived modestly in my small rental house, carefully budgeting my librarian's salary and never knowing that I was actually supporting their lifestyle. The clock on my mantel chimed midnight, officially ending what should have been my brother's wedding day. Instead of celebrating the beginning of his marriage, I was sitting in my living room surrounded by evidence of his complicity in financial fraud, trying to understand how the people who were supposed to love and protect me had instead chosen to steal from me and then blame me for my own exclusion from their lives. But as I sat there in the quiet darkness, I realized something had fundamentally shifted inside me. For the first time in my adult life, I had concrete proof that my family's treatment of me wasn't based on my shortcomings or social inadequacies. I wasn't too awkward or too honest or too difficult. I was too smart, too observant, too likely to discover the truth they'd been working so hard to conceal. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, I would take the evidence Evangeline had given me and begin the process of reclaiming what had been stolen from me. Tomorrow, I would stop being the victim of my family's deception and start being the architect of my own justice. But tonight, as I carefully folded the financial documents and placed them in a safe location, I allowed myself to feel something I hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of finally understanding that I had never been the problem. Sunday morning arrived with an unusual clarity, as if the emotional storm of the previous day had washed the air clean of illusions and pretense. I woke early, my mind sharp and focused in a way it hadn't been for months. The financial documents lay exactly where I'd left them, proof that the previous evening's revelations hadn't been some elaborate nightmare conjured by my wounded psyche. I made coffee and spread the papers across my kitchen table, examining them properly in the morning light. The scope of my father's deception was breathtaking in its thoroughness. He'd forged my signature on numerous documents, created fake correspondence purporting to be from me authorizing withdrawals, and systematically transferred funds from my inheritance account into various business ventures that had subsequently failed. The total amount missing was just over $320,000, money that should have been waiting for me when I turned 40 in 6 years. My phone had been buzzing intermittently since dawn, a steady stream of calls and messages from family members and friends who'd either witnessed the wedding disaster firsthand or seen the news coverage. I'd left it on silent, not yet ready to engage with the inevitable demands for explanation, the attempts at damage control, the manipulation disguised as concern. For now, I needed to think clearly about my next steps without the interference of other people's agendas. The first call I made was to Evangeline, who answered on the second ring despite the early hour. Her voice was rough with exhaustion, but she sounded more composed than she had the night before. "How are you holding up?" I asked, though I suspected we were both operating on adrenaline and shock rather than genuine emotional stability. "I've been better," she admitted with a weak laugh. I spent most of the night going through my own financial records, making sure Lysander that there weren't other deceptions I needed to know about. Thank goodness we never merged our accounts or made any major purchases together. I felt a surge of relief on her behalf. At least she'd be able to disentangle herself from my family's financial crimes without suffering additional losses. "Have you spoken to your parents yet?" "Briefly. They're horrified, of course, but supportive. My father has already contacted his attorney to make sure I'm protected legally." She paused, and I could hear the pain in her voice when she continued. "I keep thinking about all the conversations I had with your family over the past year, wondering how many of them were lies. Your mother was so warm, so welcoming. She made me feel like I was gaining a real family, not just marrying into one. The betrayal she was experiencing felt familiar, though mine had been building over decades rather than exploding in a single evening. I'm sorry you got caught up in this, Evangeline. You didn't deserve any of it." "Neither did you," she said firmly. "Which brings me to why I'm calling so early. I've been thinking about what you should do next, and I have some suggestions." She'd clearly spent the sleepless hours productively, researching legal options and mapping out strategies for recovering my stolen inheritance. Her approach was methodical and thorough, reflecting the same analytical mind that had impressed me during our discussions of art history. "First, you need to file a police report today," she said. "This isn't just a family dispute, it's criminal fraud. The longer you wait, the more time your father has to move assets or destroy evidence. The thought of involving law enforcement felt enormous, a step that would transform private family dysfunction into public legal proceedings. But she was right. What my father had done wasn't just morally wrong, it was illegal, and treating it as anything less would only enable him to continue manipulating the situation. Second, you need your own attorney, someone who specializes in financial crimes and elder abuse, she continued. I can give you the name of someone my father recommends if you'd like. Elder abuse. The term hadn't occurred to me, but it fit perfectly. My father had exploited his position as trustee of my inheritance, taking advantage of my trust and relative financial naivete to steal money that wasn't his to touch. And third, Evangeline said, her voice growing stronger, you need to be prepared for your family to fight back. They're going to try to make this about your mental state, your social awkwardness, your tendency to misinterpret situations. They're going to paint you as a difficult person who's overreacting to normal family financial arrangements. I appreciated her honesty, even though the prediction made my stomach clench with anxiety. She was probably right about their likely strategy. My parents had spent years conditioning everyone, including me, to see my perspectives and reactions as inherently unreliable. It would be natural for them to fall back on that narrative when faced with legal consequences for their actions. I have copies of everything now, I reminded her and myself. Financial records, forged signatures, loan documents, whatever story they try to tell, the evidence speaks for itself. Exactly, she said, and you won't be facing this alone. I'll testify about what I witnessed yesterday, about your great-aunt's revelations and Lysander's admission of guilt. This isn't just your word against theirs anymore. After we hung up, I sat quietly for several minutes, absorbing the magnitude of what I was about to undertake. Filing criminal charges against my own family felt like crossing a bridge that could never be uncrossed, transforming temporary estrangement into permanent rupture. But the alternative was to remain silent while my father continued to steal from me, to accept my exclusion from family events as the price of their financial crimes, to pretend that love and loyalty required me to enable their deception. By noon, I'd filed a police report and made an appointment with the attorney Evangeline had recommended. Detective Miranda Castellanos, who took my statement, was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. She listened to my story without judgment, asked pointed questions about the timeline and documentation, and assured me that financial fraud cases like mine were more common than I might think. Family members often have access to accounts and personal information that makes this kind of theft easier to accomplish, she explained as I signed my statement. The emotional manipulation that keeps victims from reporting is usually the most challenging aspect of these cases, but you seem to have a clear understanding of what's happened here. Her words were oddly comforting. After years of being told that my perceptions were skewed, that my reactions were inappropriate, that my understanding of family dynamics was fundamentally flawed, having a professional law enforcement officer validate my assessment of the situation felt like a small victory in itself. The attorney, Benjamin Thorne, was equally reassuring. He reviewed the financial documents with practiced efficiency, occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions about specific transactions. His office overlooked the downtown area where my father's construction business was located, and I found myself wondering if they'd ever crossed paths professionally, if Mr. Thorne had any previous knowledge of the Ashworth family's financial difficulties. This is a straightforward case of fiduciary fraud, he said after completing his review. Your father violated his legal obligations as trustee of your inheritance, and the documentation you've provided makes that abundantly clear. The question isn't whether we can prove he committed crimes, but how quickly we can recover your assets and what additional damages you might be entitled to. He explained the legal process that would unfold over the coming months, the civil and criminal proceedings that would run parallel to each other, the possibility that my father might try to declare bankruptcy to avoid repaying what he'd stolen. It was complex and intimidating, but Mr. Thorne's confidence in the strength of my case provided a foundation of hope I hadn't expected to find. One thing you should know, he said, as our meeting concluded, is that cases like this often expose additional financial irregularities. Your father's business records will be subject to thorough investigation, and there's a good chance we'll discover other victims, other questionable transactions. Are you prepared for the possibility that this situation is larger than just your inheritance? I hadn't considered that possibility, but it made sense. Someone who would steal from his own daughter's trust fund probably wasn't scrupulous about other financial obligations. The thought that there might be additional victims, other families who'd been deceived by my father's apparent prosperity, added another layer of moral complexity to an already overwhelming situation. That evening, my parents called. I'd been expecting it all day, dreading the conversation, but knowing it was inevitable. My mother's voice was carefully controlled, the tone she used when she was working very hard to manage a difficult situation. Isadora, darling, we need to talk about this misunderstanding with your inheritance, she began, as if the systematic theft of $300,000 was simply a communication error that could be cleared up with proper explanation. It's not a misunderstanding, Mother, I said, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. I have documentation showing that Father forged my signature and stole money from my trust account. I've filed criminal charges and hired an attorney. The silence that followed was thick with shock and calculation. I could almost hear her recalibrating, searching for a new approach that might contain the damage I was threatening to their carefully constructed life. Sweetheart, I think you're overreacting to what Great Aunt Cordelia told Evangeline, she said finally. You know how confused she gets. Her memory isn't reliable, and she often mixes up dates and details from different decades. The bank records speak for themselves, I replied. This isn't about Great Aunt Cordelia's memory. It's about Father's crimes. Crimes? My father's voice came on the line, apparently having been listening on another extension. Isadora, that money was used for family expenses, for investments that benefit all of us. You're acting like I stole from a stranger instead of managing family resources. His tone was injured righteousness, the same voice he'd used throughout my childhood when caught in contradictions or faced with consequences for his actions. But I was no longer the confused little girl who could be convinced that her perceptions were wrong, that her father's behavior was always justified by circumstances she was too young or naive to understand. You don't have the legal right to use my inheritance for any purpose without my explicit consent, I said, and you certainly don't have the right to forge my signature or exclude me from family events to prevent me from discovering what you've done. The wedding exclusion wasn't about the money, my mother interjected, though her voice lacked conviction. It was about ensuring that Lysander and Evangeline had a peaceful celebration. By lying to me about why I wasn't welcome at my own brother's wedding, I said, by making me believe that I was too socially awkward to be trusted around your business associates, when the real reason was that you were afraid I'd discover Father's fraud. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, my parents alternating between denying wrongdoing, minimizing the severity of their actions, and attempting to shift blame onto me for overreacting. It was exhausting and familiar, a dynamic I'd experienced countless times throughout my life, but with one crucial difference. I was no longer willing to accept their version of reality when I had concrete evidence to contradict it. The legal proceedings moved more quickly than I'd anticipated. Within 2 weeks, my father's business accounts had been frozen pending investigation, and a forensic accountant had been appointed to trace the movement of funds from my inheritance. The criminal investigation expanded to include potential fraud against several of my father's business partners, validating Mr. Thorne's prediction that my case would expose broader financial crimes. Lysander called me 3 weeks after his failed wedding, his voice heavy with shame and exhaustion. He'd been staying at a friend's apartment since Evangeline had ended their engagement, and he sounded like a man who'd watched his entire life collapse in the span of a single evening. "Isadora, I need to apologize," he said without preamble, "not just for the inheritance situation, but for everything. For going along with excluding you from the wedding, for not standing up to Mother and Father when I knew they were wrong, for being a coward when you needed your brother to protect you." His words touched something deep in my chest, a wound I'd carried for so long that I'd forgotten it was there. This was the brother I remembered from our childhood, the little boy who'd followed me around the backyard, asking questions and seeking approval, before our parents' manipulation had driven a wedge between us. "I was afraid," he continued, his voice breaking slightly, "afraid of disappointing them, afraid of losing their financial support, afraid of having to make my own way in the world without their connections and resources. I knew what they were doing to you was wrong, but I convinced myself it wasn't my responsibility to intervene." I listened without comment, letting him work through the confession he clearly needed to make. Part of me felt vindicated by his admission, but a larger part felt genuinely sad for the man he'd become under our parents' influence, the person who'd learned to prioritize comfort over integrity, security over justice. "I want to testify for you," he said finally, "in the criminal case, in the civil proceedings, wherever my testimony might help. I know it doesn't make up for what I've done, but it's a start." His offer surprised me. Whatever pressure our parents might be applying to keep him silent, whatever threats about disinheritance or family ostracism they might be making, he was apparently ready to choose honesty over self-preservation. "That would be helpful," I said carefully, "but I need you to understand that this isn't just about getting my money back. This is about establishing that what they did was criminal, that family relationships don't excuse fraud and manipulation." "I understand," he said. "And Isadora, I'm proud of you for fighting back. You're braver than I've ever been." The trial preparation consumed most of my autumn. Detective Castellanos had built a thorough case with help from federal investigators who'd become interested in my father's business practices. The forensic accounting revealed that my inheritance was just one of several funds he'd misappropriated over the years, using his reputation and social connections to gain access to other people's money and then deploying it to prop up his failing construction business. Evangeline proved to be an invaluable witness, her testimony about the wedding night confrontation providing crucial context for understanding my family's motivations. She'd also recovered additional documents from Lysander's apartment, financial records that further demonstrated the scope of my father's deception. "Your family underestimated her," Mr. Thorne observed during one of our preparation sessions, they thought they were getting a naive young woman who would fit quietly into their social circle, not someone with the intelligence and backbone to expose their crimes. I thought about this assessment often as the trial date approached. Evangeline had indeed been underestimated, not just by my family, but perhaps by me as well. I'd seen her academic accomplishments and appreciated her thoughtful conversation, but I hadn't fully recognized the steel beneath her polished exterior, the integrity that had prompted her to walk away from a lifestyle of privilege rather than become complicit in financial crimes. The trial itself was mercifully brief. My father's attorney attempted to portray the inheritance transfers as legitimate family financial management, but the evidence of forged signatures and unauthorized transactions was overwhelming. The emotional testimony about my exclusion from family events to conceal the fraud provided compelling context for understanding the calculated nature of my father's deception. Lysander's testimony was particularly powerful. He described the family meetings where my exclusion from his wedding had been planned, the explicit discussions about preventing me from accessing financial records, the ways our parents had manipulated both of us to maintain their lies. His obvious guilt and remorse made his testimony more credible than any professional witness could have been. When the verdict was announced, I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and something approaching closure. My father was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. The civil judgment required him to repay my full inheritance plus interest and damages, though the bankruptcy proceedings that followed meant that actual recovery would take years and might never be complete. My mother received probation and community service for her role in the conspiracy, a sentence that reflected her more passive participation, but still acknowledged her complicity in the deception. She'd testified that she'd tried to discourage my father from using my inheritance, but the documented evidence suggested her resistance had been minimal and short-lived. The most unexpected development came during the sentencing phase, when Great-Aunt Cordelia appeared in court to deliver a victim impact statement. At 87, she was frailer than I remembered, but her mind was sharp and her voice clear as she addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I want the court to understand that this family has a long history of financial manipulation," she said, her words carrying the weight of decades of observation. Auberon Ashworth learned these behaviors from his own father, who used family resources to fund failed business ventures while lying to relatives about the family's financial stability. This pattern has continued for 2 generations, and it will continue into the 3rd generation unless there are consequences severe enough to break the cycle. Her testimony recontextualized everything I thought I knew about my family history. The financial instability, the emphasis on appearances over substance, the willingness to exploit family relationships for monetary gain, these weren't recent developments, but inherited patterns that had shaped multiple generations of Ashworth men. I was apparently the first family member to refuse to accept these patterns as normal, to demand accountability rather than enabling continued dysfunction. After the trial, I found myself in the strange position of rebuilding my life without the family relationships that had defined it for 34 years. My parents' conviction had effectively ended our relationship, at least for the foreseeable future. They blamed me for destroying the family, for choosing legal action over forgiveness, for refusing to accept their version of events even after their crimes had been exposed in court. Lysander was different. His testimony during the trial had marked the beginning of a tentative reconciliation between us, built on honesty rather than the shared mythology our parents had constructed. He was working to establish his own identity, separate from our family's expectations, pursuing a master's degree in social work and volunteering with financial literacy programs for low-income families. The irony of his chosen field wasn't lost on either of us, but it seemed to represent genuine attempts at redemption rather than superficial image management. "I want to understand how families become dysfunctional," he told me during one of our monthly coffee meetings, "how patterns of manipulation and abuse get passed down through generations, and what it takes to break those cycles. I think our family's story might be more common than we realize." His insight was probably correct. The trial had attracted some media attention, and I had received several calls from other families who recognized similar patterns in their own experiences. Financial exploitation by trusted relatives was apparently far more prevalent than most people realized, hidden by shame and enabled by social expectations about family loyalty. 6 months after the trial, I received an unexpected visitor. Evangeline knocked on my door on a bright Saturday morning in early spring, carrying a bottle of wine and what appeared to be a small gift. She looked healthier than I'd seen her since before the wedding disaster, her auburn hair catching the sunlight and her smile reaching her eyes in a way that hadn't been true during the trial proceedings. "I wanted to thank you," she said as I invited her in, "and to celebrate." The gift was a small framed photograph of the two of us from Lysander's birthday party the previous year, one of the few pictures where I looked genuinely happy rather than awkwardly posed. I'd forgotten the photo existed, but seeing it reminded me of the friendship we'd developed before everything had fallen apart. "What are we celebrating?" I asked, opening the wine she'd brought. "My dissertation defense," she said with obvious pride. "I passed last week, which means I'm officially Dr. Evangeline Thornfield now, and I got the job at the museum in Portland, the one I'd been hoping for." I raised my glass in genuine celebration. She'd worked incredibly hard to complete her doctorate while dealing with the emotional aftermath of her broken engagement and the stress of testifying in a federal fraud trial. Her success felt like a victory for both of us, proof that we could build meaningful lives despite the chaos my family had brought into our worlds. "There's something else," she said, her expression growing more serious. "I've been thinking about your situation, about what comes next for you now that the legal proceedings are finished, and I have a proposition." Her idea was both unexpected and intriguing. The museum in Portland was expanding their medieval manuscript collection, and they needed someone with expertise in historical document preservation and research. My background in library science, combined with my experience uncovering and documenting financial fraud, had apparently given me skills that were directly applicable to academic research and archival work. "It would be a fresh start," she said earnestly, "a chance to build a career based on your actual interests and abilities, rather than just taking whatever positions were available locally. And Portland is far enough from here that you wouldn't have to deal with the ongoing family drama, but close enough that you could visit if you wanted to maintain relationships with people like Lysander." The opportunity was tempting for reasons beyond just career advancement. Over the past year, I discovered that I actually enjoyed investigative work, The process of uncovering hidden truths and documenting complex situations, the skills I'd developed while researching my family's financial crimes might indeed translate well to academic research, particularly in fields where careful documentation and analytical thinking were essential. More importantly, the position would allow me to start over in a place where I wasn't defined by my family's dysfunction, where I could build relationships based on my actual personality rather than other people's assumptions about my social adequacy. The trial had shown me that I was capable of fighting for myself when necessary, but it had also left me eager to focus on constructive goals rather than defensive strategies. I accepted the position, though the transition took several months to arrange. During that time, I sold my small house and began the process of physically separating myself from the geographical reminders of my family's betrayal. The sale proceeds, combined with the partial recovery of my inheritance, gave me enough financial security to make choices based on personal fulfillment rather than economic necessity. My last conversation with my mother took place on a gray November afternoon, 3 days before my move to Portland. She'd called to make one final attempt at reconciliation, though her version of reconciliation involved me accepting responsibility for tearing the family apart and agreeing to maintain the fiction that the trial had been an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than accountability for criminal behavior. "You've gotten what you wanted," she said, her voice brittle with resentment. "Your father is in prison, our family's reputation is destroyed, and you're moving away to start over. I hope you're satisfied with the damage you've caused." For a moment, I felt the familiar pull of guilt and self-doubt that had characterized my relationship with my parents for decades. The urge to apologize, to take responsibility for their choices, to prioritize their comfort over my own well-being was still there, still powerful, despite everything I'd learned about their manipulation. But I'd spent too many months in therapy, read too many books about family dysfunction, and received too much validation from independent sources to fall back into those old patterns. My parents had created this situation through their own choices. I'd simply refused to continue enabling their deception. "I'm satisfied that justice was served," I said quietly, "and I'm hopeful that the consequences will prevent future victims from experiencing what I went through. That feels like a positive outcome, even if it's not what you wanted." "You sound like a stranger," she said, and there was genuine bewilderment in her voice. "This isn't the daughter I raised." She was right in a way. The daughter she'd raised would have remained silent about the theft, would have accepted exclusion from family events as natural and deserved, would have blamed herself for the family's dysfunction rather than holding the actual perpetrators accountable. That daughter had been a construction of their manipulation, a version of myself designed to serve their needs rather than my own interests. "No," I agreed. "This is the daughter you should have raised, the one who knows her own worth and won't accept being treated as less than family while funding your lifestyle." The conversation ended there, with mutual acknowledgement that we had fundamentally different perspectives on family relationships and personal responsibility. It wasn't the dramatic confrontation I might have expected, but rather a quiet recognition that we'd chosen incompatible paths forward. My new life in Portland began with unexpected ease. The museum work was intellectually stimulating in ways I hadn't anticipated, combining historical research with detective-like investigation into the provenance and authenticity of medieval manuscripts. My colleagues appreciated my analytical approach and attention to detail, qualities that had been viewed as social liabilities in my family context but were professional assets in academic settings. Evangeline and I developed a genuine friendship independent of our shared history with my family's crimes. She introduced me to her circle of graduate student friends, a group of intelligent, quirky academics who valued substance over style and seemed genuinely interested in my perspectives on various topics. For the first time in my adult life, I found myself in social situations where my tendency toward honest observation was welcomed rather than merely tolerated. 6 months after moving to Portland, I received a call from Lysander with unexpected news. He'd been accepted into a doctoral program in family therapy with research focus on financial abuse within family systems. But more surprisingly, he'd also reconnected with Evangeline and they'd begun dating again. "I know it sounds crazy," he said when I expressed my astonishment, but we both went through intensive therapy after the trial, and we realized that what destroyed our relationship wasn't incompatibility, but the lies and manipulation we'd both been subjected to. We're taking things very slowly, building trust from the ground up, but it feels authentic in a way it never did before. Their reconciliation was indeed surprising, but it also felt somehow appropriate. They'd both been victims of my family's deception, both been manipulated into participating in my exclusion, both been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their relationships. If they could build something genuine from that shared experience of disillusionment, perhaps their connection was stronger than I'd given it credit for. The most significant change in my own life came 18 months after the trial, when I met Professor Nathaniel Whitmore at a conference on medieval manuscript preservation. He was a few years older than me, recently divorced, with a teenage daughter and a dry sense of humor that complemented my own tendency toward wry observation. Our relationship developed slowly, built on shared intellectual interests and compatible values, rather than the dramatic passion that seemed to characterize most romance stories. "You're remarkably self-aware for someone who spent decades being gaslighted by her own family," he observed during one of our early conversations about my background. "Most people who go through that kind of systematic manipulation struggle with trusting their own perceptions for years afterward." His comment helped me understand something I'd been puzzling over since the trial. Despite the emotional trauma of discovering my family's betrayal, I hadn't experienced the kind of long-term psychological damage that might have been expected. My confidence in my own judgment had actually increased rather than decreased as a result of the experience. "I think the financial documentation made the difference," I told him. Having concrete proof that my perceptions were accurate, that my family's version of events was objectively false, made it impossible for me to doubt myself the way I might have otherwise. The evidence had indeed been crucial, not just for legal proceedings, but for my own psychological recovery. Without bank records and forged signatures and documented timelines, I might have continued to question whether my family's treatment of me was really as problematic as it felt. The black and white nature of financial fraud had provided clarity that purely emotional or social manipulation might not have offered. 2 years after moving to Portland, I received a wedding invitation that surprised me more than anything else that had happened in this strange journey. Lysander and Evangeline were getting married again, But this time, they wanted me to be Evangeline's maid of honor. The ceremony would be small, just immediate family and close friends, and they'd specifically designed it to avoid the kind of elaborate social performance that had characterized their first attempt. We know it might be awkward, given everything that's happened, Evangeline said when she called to extend the invitation, but you're the person who gave me the courage to walk away from a marriage built on lies, and you're the person who showed Lysander what it means to choose integrity over comfort. We can't imagine celebrating our real relationship without including the person who made it possible. I accepted the invitation, though I was honest about my mixed feelings regarding my parents' potential presence. They'd been released from prison 6 months earlier and were apparently living in a small apartment across town, their social standing destroyed and their financial resources exhausted by legal fees and restitution payments. They won't be invited, Lysander assured me when we discussed the guest list. This wedding is about moving forward with people who value honesty and genuine connection. That doesn't include anyone who's still invested in maintaining the old family mythology. The wedding took place on a beautiful October afternoon in the botanical garden where Evangeline had first told me about her art history research 2 years earlier. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, focused on the commitment the couple was making to each other rather than the social spectacle they wanted to create for others. I stood beside Evangeline as she married my brother for the second time, and I felt genuinely happy for both of them in ways I hadn't thought possible during their first engagement. The reception was held in a small restaurant overlooking the river, with toasts that focused on authenticity and second chances rather than traditional wedding platitudes. When Lysander stood to speak about his new wife, he also addressed the journey that had brought them to this point. 2 years ago, our first attempt at marriage failed because we'd built our relationship on a foundation of family expectations and social pressures, rather than honest communication and shared values, he said, his voice steady and clear. We're here today because we learned that real love requires the courage to face uncomfortable truths, to reject relationships that aren't based on mutual respect, and to rebuild from a place of authenticity rather than convenience. He looked directly at me during the final part of his speech. We're particularly grateful to Isadora, who showed us what it means to fight for justice, even when it's difficult, even when it costs you relationships you thought you valued. She taught us that family isn't about protecting each other's lies, but about supporting each other's growth into the people we're meant to be. His words moved me more than I'd expected, not just because they represented acknowledgement of my choices, but because they suggested that my painful experience had contributed to something positive in their lives. The destruction of our family's mythology had been necessary for authentic relationships to develop, and perhaps my willingness to endure that destruction had benefited all of us in the long run. As I write this account 2 years later, I'm sitting in the small office at the Portland Museum, where I now serve as senior curator of medieval manuscripts. Outside my window, the autumn leaves are beginning to turn, marking the approach of another anniversary of that devastating wedding night that changed everything. Tomorrow, Nathaniel and I will travel to the coast for a long weekend, celebrating our engagement, a relationship that feels stable and genuine in ways I never expected to experience. Lysander and Evangeline are expecting their first child next spring, and they've asked me to be the godmother. We see each other regularly now, our relationship built on the foundation of shared honesty rather than inherited obligation. They're both thriving in their respective careers, having discovered that integrity can indeed be more valuable than social connections when it comes to professional success. My parents and I have had no contact since my move to Portland. I occasionally hear updates about their circumstances through mutual acquaintances, but we've apparently reached a mutual understanding that reconciliation isn't possible as long as they remain unwilling to acknowledge the harm they caused. I feel sad about this sometimes, but I no longer feel guilty about it. They made choices that had consequences, and those consequences have shaped the reality we all live with now. The financial recovery from my inheritance has been slow but steady. My father's restitution payments will continue for several more years, and there's a possibility that additional assets will be recovered as his bankruptcy proceedings continue. But the money matters less to me now than it did during the immediate aftermath of the trial. What was taken from me wasn't just financial security, but years of wondering why I felt so disconnected from my own family, years of accepting blame for problems I hadn't created. The real recovery has been psychological rather than financial, learning to trust my own perceptions, building relationships based on mutual respect rather than inherited obligation, discovering that I'm actually quite capable of navigating social situations when I'm surrounded by people who value authenticity over performance. These changes have been worth more than any amount of money. Great Aunt Cordelia passed away peacefully last month at the age of 88. I attended her funeral, where I learned that she'd spent her final years advocating for elder abuse awareness and financial fraud prevention. Her unexpected intervention at Lysander's wedding reception had been the catalyst for exposing my family's crimes, but apparently it had also inspired her to work toward protecting other potential victims from similar exploitation. As I sat in the church listening to stories about her advocacy work, I realized that my willingness to pursue justice rather than maintain family secrets had contributed to something larger than my individual situation. The patterns of financial manipulation that had characterized multiple generations of my family had finally been broken, not just for me, but potentially for future victims who might benefit from increased awareness and stronger legal protections. The awkward, socially inappropriate sister who was too dangerous to invite to her brother's wedding had become a woman who understood her own worth, who built meaningful relationships based on genuine connection, who used her analytical skills to contribute something valuable to the world. The transformation wasn't magical or sudden, but rather the natural result of finally being free to become the person I'd always had the potential to be, unencumbered by other people's expectations and manipulations. Sometimes I think about that evening 3 years ago when I turned on the television and saw my brother being slapped by his bride in front of 350 guests. At the time, it felt like the complete destruction of our family, the devastating exposure of everything ugly and dysfunctional in our relationships. Now, I understand that it was actually the beginning of our family's healing, the moment when truth finally became more powerful than the elaborate fiction we'd all been living within. The woman who destroyed my brother's first wedding by exposing our family's financial crimes had indeed saved my life, exactly as I'd written in that journal entry so long ago. But she'd also saved Lysander's life and Evangeline's life, and possibly the lives of future victims who would benefit from the legal precedents our case had established. Sometimes the most destructive moments turn out to be the most redemptive if we have the courage to build something authentic from the ruins of what was never really working in the first place.